as the key to success in the invasion of any nation involved the complete and abject removal of its command and control systems, as well as punishing strikes against its logistical forces to deny supplies and support to the defenders' combat units. In the instance of the American defenders, as their forces were exceedingly spread too thin, including even around the world, as they hurriedly mustered their available reserve and guard forces of the Army, as well as also alphabet paramilitary auxiliaries of their paramilitary elements. In the case of these forces being stretched exceedingly thin, they had to tailor their defense plans accordingly, which included aggressive patrolling to make the best use of limited manpower, as in sending them out frequently to patrol infrastructure and other critical areas important to national security, as also in the case of the opening of the largest ever invasion in all human history. The 12.5 million coalition invasion forces, which essentially were mostly Chinese and Russian forces, but also a 500,000 strong contingent of the Foreign Expeditionary Army, which was comprised of the other coalition nations, as the Chinese by far contributed the most troops at 10 million and the Russians at 2. This massive 12.5 million man invasion force was already at midnight conducting the complete removal of command and control via the advanced ASAT or anti-satellite weapons capabilities, in addition to also the exceedingly large and well-funded cyber warfare arms of both China and Russia and the other nations as well, completely hacking into everything connected to the internet, which included the nation's power grid and water grid, as well as telecom, the internet itself, and also the military networks as well that were also connected to the internet and thus could be hacked and shut off. All of this created the maximum amount of chaos imaginable throughout the country, as the very potent, locally used electronic warfare assets of the coalition, which could include air, land, or sea-based systems on coastal areas in terms of the sea-based weapons, completely jammed any redundant forms of communication, such as radio and also ISR capabilities, such as radar and drones, for instance. And as all of these capabilities were completely removed, the ability to acquire actionable intelligence and coordinate actions on the battlefield completely disintegrated amongst the American defending forces. Within the South Central invasion sector, as the air power deployed was simply punishing, within the Midland-Odessa battle space, the Iranian Air Force, along with the PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force, deployed 4 total squadrons in terms of their air power allocated to just this one battle, which included 2 fighter squadrons, the PLAAF contributing its highly advanced J-35A fighter aircraft, 5th-gen aircraft, which were a Air Force analog, effectively, to the naval-based carrier versions of this fighter jet, and the Iranian Air Force contributing an F-14 Tomcat squadron. While not quite anywhere near as advanced or capable as the J-35A, this aircraft still had plenty of utility as a combat plane. Also involved were the strike aircraft squadrons, as the Iranian Air Force contributed a squadron of Su-24 strike aircraft, which carried a punishing payload exceeding 17,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, closer to 18, and the PLAAF's heavy-hitting champion of strike aircraft, the JH-7, which carried roughly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as the strike aircraft would absolutely demolish everything below them in terms of their assigned targets. These aircraft would make a massive impact on the battle as a whole, as they would directly support the ground forces as well as carrying out pre-planned strike operations according to the original war plans. At the operational level, all of the campaigns unfolding within the South Central invasion sector and even the nation as a whole all worked together like cogs in a well-oiled machine, as in events that were happening in battles in different sectors directly affected the outcomes of others. as it pertained to the Midland and Odessa campaign, the American defensive plan called for the use of their Fort Bliss air defense elements that were based there to provide air defense support to the defenders in Midland-Odessa, as well as other defenders in other portions of the South Central invasion sector, such as in New Mexico. However, due to the Fort Bliss-El Paso battle and its accompanying SEAD operations, or suppression of enemy air defense operations, occurring concurrently to all the other operations unfolding within the fourth-gen warfare doctrines, which would see the aspect of the Trojan horse blended with the common external components to completely and utterly overwhelm the defenders of the massive nation. The fighting in Fort Bliss denied the reinforcements that would not be forthcoming to the defenders in Midland-Odessa due to the massive operation that was now taking place hundreds of miles to the west in that particular battle. Also, all of the operations directed against the USAF and U.S. Naval Aviation, as well as also even Marine Corps Aviation, denied air defenses from the air for the defenders on the ground, which the defensive plans had called for in case of any form of any attack, as the Sino-Russian naval drills occurring off both coasts went hot. And now the satellite dazing technology, which concealed the movements and positioning of the forward deployed forces in Canada and Mexico in terms of the external components, now revealed the gargantuan scope and scale of the invasion. It was not small-scale strikes and attacks, it was a full-scale invasion. It was total war, complete, total ruination and destruction of a nation and its defenses. As the orbiting KJ-2000, one of multiple AWACS aircraft directing the air combat, directed the only air-on-air engagement in the entirety of the South Central invasion sector, as two additional PLAAF fighter squadrons that flew further ahead and north of the Midland-Odessa battlespace used their beyond visual range missile capabilities with the assistance of the KJ-2000 to completely annihilate the only airborne USAF fighter squadron that was in the air at the opening of this invasion, as they were completely and thoroughly destroyed. The aircraft, in terms of the fighter aircraft in the Midland-Odessa battlespace, were running defensive cover for the KJ-2000, as well as the orbiting Y-9LG prop plane aircraft, which was an electronic warfare / electronic intelligence gathering aircraft, as the electronic warfare capabilities of the Y-9LG, along with the electronic warfare capabilities aboard the JH-7s, worked together to jam redundant radio and radar systems on the ground, including even multi-mission radars, which were being utilized by some of the American forces. As the missile strikes coming in from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command's two brigades deployed in Mexico adjacent to the South Central invasion sector, which were the 612th and 613th, which had been reinforced by called-up reserve battalions to fire older and widely mass-produced systems, were lobbing thousands of missiles into the land as they alone, along with the 616th, which was a Trojan unit based in Texas, would, throughout the course of the first day, be non-stop reloading and firing tactical ballistic and cruise missiles at multiple targets, as also the Club K systems, which were container-based and disguised and hidden throughout the nation, would also count as part of the missile force's capabilities of cruise missiles, and there were many thousands of these missiles ready to launch at the strike of 2 a.m. or 2 hours into the invasion as a whole. As the main objectives were mostly economic objectives, as the area in question in the Permian Basin was an enormous energy hub, as well as also having massive amounts of vital minerals and metals for Chinese industry. The People's Armed Police, as intelligence gathered from hacking into the U.S. regime's systems as they kept diligent records of militia forces, aided in the decision of deployment of certain units. And as the People's Armed Police were a brutally fanatical paramilitary, Praetorian, almost Waffen-SS-like force of the Chinese, they deployed these quasi-elite crack fighting forces in this sector as they knew they would achieve results and achieve them fast, as the People's Armed Police were extremely aggressive in their combat style as they would race towards their objectives with almost no regard for the peril they faced, as they were fanatics, as they also would commit massive atrocities when compared to the PLA as an actual military force that observed basic humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions for the most part. The PAP did not, and they had little to no regard for the civilian population, who they would brutalize and end up forcing into forced labor brigades in terms of those they did not outright slaughter. As these forces of the People's Armed Police 2nd Light Armored Division were now on the move, breaking out of their CCP regime properties, which had been strategically purchased as close as possible to their given objectives in accordance with the fourth-generation warfare doctrine of pre-positioning the Trojan shock forces with their equipment and weapons and massive quantities of logistics on these CCP regime properties, sent out their combat forces to seize their pre-assigned objectives and or flank clearance missions, as the flank clearance missions would support the drive on specific objectives themselves. As, again, the coalition was well aware of where these militias were stationed and roughly what type of capabilities they had, although they might not have known every single solitary detail or weapons type they possessed. They knew enough to know where they were, and they were constantly reconning these areas with their ISR apparatus, which was all-encompassing and could see virtually everything that was above ground. And the quadcopter assets mixed together with the higher altitude recon assets, such as these WZ-8 stealth recon drones, which even had some ground penetrating capabilities, and the armed high altitude CH-4As that orbited the battle space, along with satellite above them, all interlocked to map the area in real time and acted as the eyes and ears of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, or the coalition's battle management AI system, if you will. Also, radars also combined with the system to act as eyes and ears for the AI, which would create pre-prepared strike packages for artillery, aircraft, missile forces, and more, and also even guide troops down to the squad level in their tactics, their angle and traverse of weapons, and more, to both prevent friendly fire incidences, as well as also help them in economizing their firepower against enemy targets and guiding them even on their movements by giving them advice on terrain features and even complete building layouts of every single solitary building in the country and more. As the real-time AI battlefield data processing system was guiding these forces in their operations, at the opening, the two brigades that comprised the entirety of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division had all of their comprising battalions in full operation and on the move, as the 1st Brigade primarily operated in the Odessa side of the battle space, which was a 50-mile east-west by 40-mile north-south battle space, with the 2nd Brigade operating in the Midland side of the battle space, and even the 350th Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps' 7th Division from Xinjiang was operating in this battle space as well, and would even contribute to one of the battles directly, as two of their battalion's 3 sapper or combat engineer companies, as this was a paramilitary civil and combat engineering force, would help in the assault against the ICE detention facility and the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion's forward operating base positions directly connected to it, as a People's Armed Police armored battalion from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division would also assault the facility and the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion with massive artillery support, missile strikes from the Strategic Missile Forces, and air strikes involved, while they would try to capture the facility nearby almost completely intact. As all of this was underway, The International Air and Spaceport of Midland was also under immediate assault at the opening of the invasion, and a high concentration of potent defending forces were placed at this location, which included all of the 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion of the larger 155th Armored Brigade combat team, minus, of course, its Alpha Company, which had been deployed to a key position in a road junction at the north of the city of Odessa on its outermost outskirts, as this position on the local municipal airport enabled the Alpha Company to patrol ostensibly the entire city of Odessa, as the highway of 385 bisected the city, as well as there being ring roads around the city, which included also Interstate 20 and more, and 338. As they could patrol the area easily from this location, they also strategically were close to their logistical resources, as the 106th Brigade Support Battalion was posted to the National Guard Armory in the north of Odessa, only a mile to the south of the Alpha Company's position, which was a main battle tank company of M1A2s in the National Guard Armory, as the 106th Brigade Support Battalion was comprised of its headquarters and headquarters company, which was its command logistical and some administrative components, as well as also the Alpha Company being the main transportation, distribution, and logistical company, with the Bravo Company being a maintenance company and Charlie Company being medical. These were the main logistical forces of the entirety of the 155th Armored Brigade combat team, as the 155th had some of its comprising battalions deployed elsewhere to secure other key locations throughout the south central invasion sector, although 3 of its battalions were present, along with its headquarters and headquarters company, which were its command and administrative forces over the whole brigade, and were given command over all of the defenses, including even the paramilitary defenders of the alphabet forces that were deployed here as well, even though they were under ostensibly a different chain of command. They actually would work in tandem with the U.S. Army National Guard and even the reserve forces, which included the 877th Quartermaster Company, which were the chief logistical forces from the Permian Basin Army Reserve Center just outside the airport, which served as the logistical support for the defenders in the airport proper. As the locations and more were all under assault at this time that had been mentioned, the battle that would erupt for both the U.S. Army National Guard installation as well as the nearby municipal airport, which was another key location coveted by the invasion forces for its proximity to the road junctions and the ability to act as a forward operating base to control Odessa, was to be seized and cleared by a light mechanized infantry battalion from the 1st Brigade of the larger 2nd Light Armored Division. On a nearby CCP regime property, as these were 2 CCP regime ranches where these vehicles were hid in industrial-sized barns and metal portable buildings, along with their supplies, the combat companies of these 2 battalions broke out, leaving only their headquarters and support companies present to run supplies and logistical support to their forward combat companies as they advanced. As the nearby, to the south of the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, Armored Battalion was tasked with seizing an important economic objective, being the oil reclamation plant, and would end up clearing this plant from over 600 armed reactionary civilians that appeared in West Odessa, as this area was known as West Odessa. Many of them, having had worked at the plant or currently worked there, had the idea to hurriedly move to this facility as it provided better defensive positions. Again, these were only ordinary armed civilians, but they at least had enough logic to know that they needed to get out of their suburban neighborhoods and head for safety. So they all got in their vehicles and flew down the local roads the short distance to the oil reclamation plant, as again, because of the loss of radio, internet, satellite, and any other type of communications imaginable, the only form of communications were line of sight, earshot, or runner-based, and as they ran yelling through their neighborhoods, as the whistling of artillery shells pounded the area, as a single firing battery from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division's howitzers, from one battery, 8 howitzers, opened fire on this neighborhood at the very opening. These personnel flew and got out of the way of the line of advance of the light mechanized infantry battalion as they raced down the rural roads from their CCP regime property towards their objectives. As many vehicles that were on the road at this time at the opening swerved out of the way as they saw these vehicles coming, the infantry fighting vehicles would fire short bursts of 30mm autocannon fire that would shred cars into absolute scrap and pieces of metal, destroying this car, blowing it into many pieces, and destroying this car near it as they swerved off the road to get out of the way of the column of vehicles headed their direction, as well as also coax fire from their coaxial 7.62 by 54mm machine gun beneath it, which sprayed this pickup truck. And the civilian that happened to have a pistol trying to get out and run for cover was cut down in a hail of machine gun fire. This Jeep swerved onto the other side of the road and was also hit by machine gun fire. As the APC versions carried W85 12.7mm heavy machine guns, these vehicles were exceedingly well armed. As they raced down the rural roads towards their objectives in the city on its northernmost outskirts, the civilians, as again, the PAP had no regard for them, were simply blasted out of the way if they were even anywhere near impeding the advance of these forces, as they were originally going to be detoured to engage and destroy this grouping, which would have wasted valuable time in them surprising the Alpha Company at the very opening of hostilities, as the first munitions were now beginning to land on the nearby National Guard site, as well as airstrikes, which the Alpha Company was now witnessing. The battalion was now rerouted back to its original objective as these forces were now fleeing to the oil reclamation plant, which the slightly slower moving armored battalion would reach in roughly 30 minutes' time before surrounding it and engaging the defending forces in battle and clearing the facility. In the meantime, as the light armored battalion raced for their objectives, which, as this battalion was comprised of 7 combat companies of light mechanized infantry and a headquarters and support company, the 7 combat companies raced towards their objectives, leaving behind their headquarters and support company, who would truck in logistics as needed, as they would spread out in their combat companies, all 7, and destroy and or clear forces from this area of the defenders. As they moved toward the area, the entire firepower of the artillery battalion of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division was all concentrated on hitting the National Guard armory with their Type 59-I-1 battery in the battalion, which was slightly more powerful, 130mm of their howitzers firing, as well as all 6 firing batteries of their Type 83 towed 122mm howitzers, all opening fire now in the first 30 minutes at least against the U.S. Army National Guard site. They would reorient their firepower again to hit other targets after the first 30 minutes had elapsed of a massive artillery bombardment against the site. On the site was the 106th Brigade Support Battalion. If we go to the map of this particular area, within this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south map sat the Army National Guard Armory, which was now swollen by vehicles and troops and equipment of the 106th Brigade Support Battalion. The headquarters and headquarters company's vehicles, the Charlie Company's vehicles, which were medical, which included the M113 ambulance versions of these armored personnel carriers, as well as also the Alpha and Bravo Company, which were logistical and maintenance forces, including the portable maintenance bay of the Bravo Company, which was now servicing vehicles as the invasion kicked off, were all being pummeled by artillery fires, as the artillery shells were the first to land before the arrival of tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes coming from a single DF-21A strike on this building containing 100 defenders, along with artillery shells and airstrikes, as well as also the larger building containing 200 personnel being hit by an even more powerful DF-3A, which carried a 4,400-pound conventional warhead, as well as multiple artillery strikes from 130 and 122mm shelling, and an enormous airstrike on this area. It has to be understood, and many people have no concept of the power of a single 1,000-pound munition, but a single 1,000-pound air-to-ground HE bomb can effectively have a blast radius of anywhere between 350 to 450 meters, or nearly half a kilometer, depending all on the type of target hit, the terrain around the target area, and the topography. And also, in this case, being that it was flat, mostly asphalt and or concrete ground in this area, in the open motor pool areas, these munitions had a wider spread than would be the case if they hit targets out in fields or other types of terrain. And the massive concentration of all these munitions within a 1 kilometer north-south by 750 meter east-west area was simply phenomenal. The level of destruction was absolute. No one, save a very small few who thought quickly, or quick thinkers, got away from this onslaught. As the tactical ballistic missiles came in, there would be 3 subsonic long-range DH-10A cruise missile strikes, 2 hitting the same building as the DF-3A, 1 hitting the same building as the DF-21A. Around the same time came the airstrikes. 2 pairs of JH-7s would come in to strike their targets, as well as also 2 pairs of Su-24 strike aircraft of the Iranian Air Force, in addition to the PLAAF aircraft, as also the first volley of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions equipped with heat warheads also flew in to hit targets in the area. All of this in a shock and awe fashion, where these systems were all hitting the area at near or about the same time. As the personnel closest to the exits and or fence line that they would smash through in vehicles that had the capability to quickly left the area when the first shells began to land on the facility, including these 2 up-armored Humvees here with turret gunners who broke through the fencing, along with this MRAP, a Max Pro MRAP breaking out, and even these 4 troops sneaking over the fence while this MRAP would take some damage from the first munitions dropped in this area while it was literally breaking out, with these 2 ATVs following very close behind, barely avoiding absolute destruction at the moment, while this MRAP, these troops quickly got in the open back hatch as these 2 MRAPs are guarding the entry point with this guard shack. This MRAP would flee across this wooded field and trees planted within it, and over here was a large shopping center, as this was Andrews Highway, which was the address of this facility. Directly behind it was 385, the highway that bisected the city of Odessa from the north and south, as well as also 45th Street, and just to the north off map east-west was 46th Street. As the battle was underway, and all of these munitions pulverized this installation with a massive degree of accuracy, almost leaving the surrounding areas, which were populated by apartment complexes and small businesses, nearly unharmed, as the concentration of munitions generally all fell within this area, this concentrated area, as accuracy was important to ensure the thorough and complete destruction of enemy logistics according to the coalition's plans. As these 2 pairs of Su-24s flew in, these 2 each dropped 4,000 pounds each on these vehicles in this area, which would wipe out these troops and badly damage the massive fuel container on the facility that contained 50,000 gallons of fuel. And these 2 forward supply vehicles, these M113s, broke out of the fencing at the very opening of these shells landing, along with this MRAP that was posted to guard this corner on this street here, would all break out and flee towards the general southwest, taking this street and going down this southwest facing street and across the parking area of these apartments. As that would occur, these vehicles would later be intercepted by the WZ-551s of the arriving spearheading company of the light mechanized infantry, who would enter the area approximately 30 minutes after the massive barrage had begun. And they en route would intercept the fleeing two M113s and the Max Pro MRAP, which they would light up completely with 30 millimeter autocannon fire, as well as 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire, with rapid 30 millimeter strikes, blasting these vehicles into complete total scrap metal and throwing them in multiple directions with HE armor piercing ammunition, as well as destroying the Max Pro MRAP that was with them in the same manner, as the 30 millimeter autocannon could rip through both these types of vehicles like a hot knife through butter, especially with that ammunition type. As they would flee the area and be later intercepted at the opening, as 8,000 pounds were dropped by this JH-7 on this area, the S shops, which was S1 through S6 of the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, were located in these buildings on the facility, as the S shops consisted of the S1, which was the personnel department of the battalion effectively, the S2, which was the intel department or intel section of the battalion, as well as also S3 being operations and planning and resource allocation. S4 was logistics and supply and maintenance. S5 was civil affairs, and S6 was communication and IT, along with the commander. They were all wiped out in these airstrikes, artillery strikes, which were repeated shells landed on these imminent strike markers. All buildings surrounded in red mean they were completely annihilated, including this fuel tank, which had purple here due to the Iranian strikes damaging the fuel tank. These vehicles got out before these air and missile strikes really came in. They were destroyed inside these buildings by the hits from the tactical ballistic cruise missiles, artillery, and air strikes, thoroughly annihilating all of these buildings and vehicles and personnel. As again, many cannot fathom the power of a single 1,000-pound munition, but multiple 1,000-pound munitions landing in a concentrated area would cause a hurricane, a tornado of debris, scrap metal, tossed vehicles, which would weigh almost nothing, being thrown about and ripped into multiple flaps and pieces of scrap metal being thrown in many directions, tents ripped to shreds, including with the personnel that were inside of them, with many body parts being dismembered and ripped apart and thrown in multiple directions. Many people simply disintegrating in the explosions due to the concussive blast wave and the power thereof, as continued munitions, 1,000-pounders, would continue to land in the motor pool. This motor pool, with vehicles all lined up, were gradually being destroyed and ripped to pieces, vehicles being tossed to and fro, as others were completely and totally destroyed and ripped to pieces, as the cabs of vehicles, the fuel tanks on vehicles, all ripped apart and thrown to and fro. These up-armored Humvees here would be destroyed by the next impact of a 1,000-pounder, along with these two Max Pro MRAPs that barely survived these two nearby hits. This being a HET, or a heavy equipment transporter truck, just ripped apart into two parts and thrown across this area from this blast here. Pieces of asphalt and concrete tossed to and fro as if it weighs nothing. Absolute, total, complete devastation. Scenes like this now erupting in the installation, in the U.S. Army National Guard installation, were also erupting against much of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as they too would be hit in the same manner by the combination of airdropped munitions, as well as cruise missile strikes and also artillery fires, all crashing down into their positions and ripping them to total pieces. As all of this was occurring and some forces had broken out, these two all-terrain vehicles with two personnel on each went down 45th Street and would temporarily for the time being escape, as with these four personnel, as they were relatively minute and tiny targets and time would not be wasted on them, at least for the time being, while these were more tempting targets, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had put together a strike package for another nearby and currently unutilized Su-24 strike aircraft of the Iranians to strike this small convoy of vehicles with 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions as they tried to flee the short distance up Highway 385 toward the nearby positions of the Alpha Company, the tank company from the larger 1st of the 635th that had been deployed in Odessa, to warn them of what was going on, as if they did not already see it in the dead of night, as pillars of smoke and short bursts of illumination from explosions could be seen the short distance, as well as heard and even felt, as this would have registered massively on the Richter scale in the area, as one MRAP broke through these two up-armored Humvees, and this MRAP would continue this way while these two ATVs went this way. All of these vehicles combined, the two MRAPs and the two up-armored Humvees, would be smashed by this precision strike with 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions from a single additional Su-24, as the original pair of Su-24s were already pounding their targets, destroying the tents, which were overflow living facilities for the troops of the different comprising companies of the 106th, as this particular Su-24 dropped nearly all of its payload of 16,000 pounds in this area, these two each dropping 4 each, as they would have more munitions for later strikes, and this one dropping a total of 8,000 pounds, completely leveling this whole area, as the JH-7s, as this pair would drop 8,000 and this one 8,000, which would spread throughout this area where artillery fires were constantly coming in, along with the DF-31A strike, fired by a called-up reserve battalion of the larger 612th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, as again they were bolstered by called-up reserve forces that fired systems that were put in long-term storage but maintained for them for use later, as well as also widely mass-produced systems like the DH-10A long-range cruise missiles. A battalion operating the DF-3As had hit this facility, destroying 200 personnel with the artillery fire and 8,000 pounds of munitions directly dropped on this one building, while the other 8,000 spread out to destroy the vehicles, along with artillery fires of the Charlie Company of the 106th. As the first strike of the JH-7s came in directly on this building, along with the DH-10A strike and the DF-21A strike, two DH-10As, along with the DF-3A, hit this building, wiping them out with artillery and air strikes from these JH-7s, while this last JH-7 came in and destroyed all of the HHC's vehicles in this area, including their fuel trucks, LMTVs, HETs, everything else. These vehicles that were in line for services at the portable maintenance facility were also destroyed in the airstrikes and the multiple shellings from the People's Armed Police Artillery Battalion, as their own artillery, within the first 30 minutes, saturated this area with a concentrated barrage of both 130mm shell fires as well as 122mm shell fires. So they fired mostly HE, but some DIPCM rounds into this facility. Everything was completely and thoroughly saturated by a torrent of different munitions, as all of this concentrated fire had been strictly reserved for not just eliminating the enemy's logistical capabilities, but also even the combat forces themselves, as destroying military forces took the utmost importance in the opening of this invasion, as the air power, even joined by the CH-901As with heat warheads, just saturated everything within this entire battle space. Some vehicles would temporarily escape and live not to fight another day, but another minute, had broken out and would flee north across this parking lot, this back area of the shopping center, of these shops here in the shopping center, and would turn onto 6th Street, get on to 385 right after the first group had been destroyed by the Su-24 strike, and would continue on to the area containing the municipal airport, where they would get out of their vehicles and try to set up fighting positions on elevated portions of the highway against other arriving companies from the People's Armed Police Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, sweeping into the area to clear any remaining defending forces, as Alpha Company would come under heavy attack by the People's Armed Police Light Mechanized Infantry Division, who in their faster and even quieter vehicles would almost be able to completely sneak in and get the drop on the Americans, as they were very nimble and fast light mechanized infantry, and they would get into positions, fighting positions that is, on small hills in the area, in people's backyards, facing the airport grounds, where they would fire their anti-tank guided missiles, such as their HJ-08s, as well as light anti-armor / anti-personnel weaponry, like their Type 69 Chinese RPGs. Even their Type 74 flamethrowers would roast personnel, as they were equipped with these devastating heavy weapons, as these light mechanized infantry forces not only could get around quickly and relatively quietly compared to their armored brethren who operated heavier, clankier, noisier vehicles that were even slower than their wheel-based vehicles, the light mechanized infantry would attack the Alpha Company on the municipal airport and vector their fire in a general L vector of fire using the combined arms capabilities of their heavy infantry weaponry alongside of the AI guided drone based capabilities from their own battalion's combat drone section, lobbing their loitering munitions into the air, such as their CH-901As, which would target the main battle tanks with heat warheads, as well as also integrating the orbiting combat drones in the area, such as the Wing-Loon 2s and 3s, as two Wing-Loon 2s would join the battle, firing their HJ-10 anti-tank guided missiles at ground targets. All of this firepower would be devastating against the defending American forces trying to hold out in their very powerful armored weaponry, although due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and the use of electronic warfare assets in the area, many critical systems these main battle tanks depended on to function effectively were down, and they would have to fight in the old way, as a manner of speaking, against the People's Armed Police, shock forces, who would, again, basically get the drop on them with their heavier infantry-based weapons that were designed for destroying main battle tanks and other heavily armored targets, as well as the danger from above coming from missiles fired from their combat drones, and also, of course, the near ubiquitous presence of the CH-901A loitering munitions with heat warheads, as another volley would be fired by the combat drones section of the same light mechanized infantry battalion that was now sweeping into this area to clear the National Guard armory, and also near simultaneously the Alpha Company from the local municipal airport only a mile away. As the spearheading company arriving on scene, as all of this destruction wiped out all the personnel present that were outdoors in the area trying to flee in many directions only to be wiped out in the air artillery and missile strikes, the vehicles that tried to escape to the southwest were the first vehicles to be destroyed by heavy firepower vectored in from the infantry fighting vehicles leading their platoons of their spearheading combat company, who shredded the M113s and the Max Pro MRAP with them to abject destruction, ripping them apart into multiple metal fragments and human body parts riddled by shrapnel, as well as ammunition, as the armor personnel carrier variants of the vehicles had their W-85 heavy machine guns, which mowed down the personnel that tried to escape from their vehicles in cold blood. As the People's Armed Police were again a Waffen-SS type force, they fought fanatically and with great determination and zeal, and they almost had no fear of losing their lives whatsoever at all. Although they were, again, not completely reckless, their level of fanaticism and aggression was unparalleled. Even the PLA didn't launch assaults with the level of determination that the People's Armed Police did, as these forces had been finely honed in the fires of war, as they had fought decades of low-intensity warfare against armed separatists in Xinjiang and even to a lesser extent in Tibet in some cases. And these People's Armed Police Forces would always conduct these heavy crackdowns to show that the regime was always in total, complete control and uncontested, as the separatist forces would be brutalized and even entire villages sheltering them would be burned down to the ground as a warning to others not to resist. As these forces now were converging onto the area, as they converged on both the National Guard Armory and the nearby municipal airport, they would clear the area after the massive attacks had concluded, as one platoon would move in across this parking lot and be able to provide any fields of fire support into this area, which now flattened and leveled after all these strikes, while this platoon moved in by this hotel, which was still intact but was damaged from the nearby munitions. And they would provide fields of fire in this area, while this platoon would enter and check for any survivors of this company. This company would then hold this area down, while the remaining 6 combat companies would converge north against the Alpha Company, which was left to contend with, as again, airstrikes were not utilized, nor were tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes against the Alpha Company, because the airport was wanted intact, as its runways were seen as useful to the coalition for logistical and or troop resupply purposes, as well as having a functional heliport at this particular municipal airport. As the People's Armed Police moved into the area, the Americans that escaped within the first 30 minutes and fled rapidly north had already spread word of the horrifying destruction that had occurred at their facility, which the Alpha Company had already witnessed from their then positions just to the north, a mile away, as also they felt it as the ground shook. As for the time being, they were only now starting to take artillery fire, as the artillery had to be exact and precise so as not to destroy anything important in this particular airport. As the airport sat on deserty ground and had very few paved areas, the runway, which was paved, and some of the small paved heliport areas and the very few paved parking lots were seen as absolutely critical and were not to be completely and thoroughly destroyed, and artillery use would be very limited, and therefore would only be used now that artillery had finished flattening the Army National Guard site, could redirect fire to other areas, and one firing battery would devote its firepower with its 122mm shells, which were slightly less destructive than the 130mm shells from the firing battery within their battalion operating the Type 59-Is, to pound the headquarters platoon in their defensive positions they prepared, to destroy their tents, their soft-skin vehicles, and such as their field truck, which was right here, LMTV's HETs, and also hitting and destroying or damaging horribly their recovery vehicle, their armored recovery vehicle, which was this vehicle here, as well as wiping out the troops of the headquarters platoon that were now milling about in this fortified area, which consisted of concertina wire, a sandbagged area for the living area, where the troops could rotate in for sleep and guard duty to their vehicles. Although they had not finished fully fortifying their compound on the airport, they had gotten an ample number of fortifications completed, including sandbagging a tank that was watching the entrance of Center Gate Road into the airport from this direction, and another tank in a fortified sandbag position watching the road here into the facility, which was called Terminal Drive, as the other tanks had just basically been moved into this position, as this platoon of tanks and this platoon of 4 tanks were watching these general directions. The 3rd platoon, which had been watching the back, had now moved across this heliport area to assist, as the first shots were now ringing out of artillery and fire now coming in from ground forces, as the telltale sign of 30mm autocannon fire from the vehicles firing under the highway bridge, as this was the access road, this is a highway, partially elevated in some areas, such as this area where it was elevated. where it came down, it became a multi-lane highway here and became a boulevard into the city here at this point. And the MRAPs that escaped had moved into this position on the other side of this highway underpass, and on the highway elevated bridge here, the three LMTVs had disembarked their troops that were aboard, and they took up position along the highway to fire down at the PAP forces moving quickly into their positions by the highway. And heavy combat now raged as the People's Armed Police deployed all of their different weaponry types against the defenders trying to fight back in these positions, as the arrival of the loitering munitions overhead had now begun as the second volley moved into the area. 48 heat warhead-equipped loitering munitions were now moving into place to strike targets on the ground. 2 Iranian F-14 Tomcat fighter aircraft from the F-14 squadron were shooting down Black Hawk helicopters that belonged to ICE, the paramilitary forces in this area, as the DHS and ICE, as the DHS more broadly, had contributed a sizable number of alphabet paramilitary forces to aid in the defenses of this area, and they had a number of Black Hawk helicopters, some of which would even fly supplies to the forces in these outposts, such as at this airport, as they had suitable helipads for heliborne operations. A Sidewinder missile had been launched from further away at a hovering Black Hawk helicopter, which would be swatted down by this air-to-air missile. As these aircraft passed higher overhead, the combat drones flew in from the southwest and southeast, respectively, 2 dedicated Wing Loon 2s to begin pounding targets with their potent HJ-10 ATGMs. As this sandbag position, there's 2 troops on the ground trying to fire over it, taking position here. Munitions had landed here and wiped out this soldier, these personnel here, destroyed these 2 on fire. This tank had already been hit and destroyed, smoke billowing out the top all the way up here. This fuel truck's trying to move through the area. This MRAP, Max Pro, about to be hit by this heat warhead-equipped loitering munition. Tanks trying to return fire with Frag T shells, would put up the best fight possible, despite the fact that the People's Armed Police in their current positions as they were dismounted from their vehicles had excellent topography from which they could pick defensive positions, as there were large rock formations in the area, mild undulations or hills. There were even wadis or crevices in the ground they could jump into as makeshift trenches to fight back against the defenders, who were doing their best to try to hold the ground. As the fighting grew ever more intense in this particular area, the vehicles were also laying down supporting fire, and as the American defenders that had escaped barely with their lives are now trying to put up the best fight they could from their positions. As one company would come under the underpass, they would now move into place with their vehicles providing an L vector of fire, with this whole company attacking from the west facing eastward. And as the artillery was now with 1 firing battery of 122mm howitzers crashing into the headquarters platoon, sending any survivors packing and trying to escape the area with their lives, as anti-tank guided missiles honed in on vehicle-based targets and would slam into main battle tanks as they try to maneuver through the area to fire at the vehicles now arriving on scene. As again, the tanks had to do everything more slowly than normal, as their normal systems were all out of whack. They had to depend mostly on their optics for guiding in their shots, as well as their turret machine gunners doing the best they could to hone in on targets, as they at least had their night vision equipment functional, as their goggles worked properly. As this tank would drive over its sandbag emplacement, trying to get out of the area as soon as the first ATGMs and loitering munitions began to crash into the area. This fight would only last 30 minutes, as this battle here, within this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south area of the airport shown, would only last a mere 30 minutes from 1 a.m. to 1:30 a.m., as the attacking companies had moved into position between 12:30 and 1 a.m., as it took them 30 minutes to enter this particular area containing the National Guard base or installation, or station rather, armory, and it took them slightly more time to enter the area adjacent to the west of the municipal airport, where they had quietly as possible snuck into position to prepare their attack. But the tripwire force, if it could be called that, would be the logistical non-combat troops that had actually escaped with their lives barely from the south moments earlier, as that battle had come to a close and the People's Armed Police light mechanized infantry forces arrived into that particular area. Having had escaped now, they would do the best they could to fight from their positions on and around the bridge, as again there was an MRAP on the other side of an underpass. They would put up the best fight possible with the weaponry they had at their disposal. As the MRAPs were equipped with M250 cal heavy machine guns, they would lay down heavy fire into the first infantry fighting vehicle protruding from under the bridge. However, they would take return fire from these vehicles and a loitering munition slam into the top of their vehicle, completely destroying them and their crew. As these vehicles continued on, they would deploy their platoons, as all three combat platoons would deploy, with one platoon facing the south to cover the flanks, as these were all suburban neighborhoods to the south and to the west and even east of the airport grounds. To the north was open fields and desert, effectively, as the road junction was just immediately north of the airport grounds. This was Wrangler Field, a baseball field, which would be fought over between headquarters platoon troops that had been rotated to the sandbag position for guard duty, who would rush for concealment into this scrub brush wooded area of mesquite trees, juniper trees, and scrub brush, Russian thistle, which are also known as tumbleweeds. And they would try to take concealment in this area and what cover they could, as again there were wadis and rock formations that they could use for cover and protection. And the People's Armed Police would have to bound in to flush them out in hand-to-hand combat. Rifle butts, bayonets, even fists and kicks would be utilized to subdue one another, as well as also firing at one another at near point-blank range, fighting in this area to the north of the baseball diamond, which was known as Wrangler Field on these airport grounds. These were the backyards of people's homes, where these slight rolling hills were located, which were now fighting positions for the deployed platoons from each combat platoon of the People's Armed Police, leaving behind their headquarters platoon further back. There were the 5 WZ-551 vehicles in the north to guard the northern flanks of their deployed platoon positioned here on this hill and behind it, as all 5 of their combat squads were here. There were also pair of combat medics who would pull out the KIAs and WIAs from these 2 squads, who would suffer heavily, as this entire half squad would be wiped out by a frag T shell from an M1 tank, and heavy machine gun fire would cut down 2 and severely wound 2 as well from this squad. There were 3 other squads, one in a diamond formation, to watch the back, as their rear flanks would be covered, as well as their northern flanks, by their vehicles. The vehicles would also suffer some destroyed vehicles, as a few heat shells that the tanks were able to get off fast enough against these vehicles would destroy them, while this would occur just before the ATGMs fired from both air as well as also from the ground would slam into them and destroy them, taking them out of commission for good and their crews, as well as also the loitering munition strikes, which likewise could completely annihilate and cripple a main battle tank and any other type of vehicle on the field. These heat warhead-equipped loitering munitions were absolutely devastating against hardened targets, including even light bunkers. As these troops from this company, as 2 companies assaulted, one from the direct west across the highway, and one racing into the south on Yukon Road, where they would deploy their ground forces, would get through the fencing and into the heliport area, and bound and cover tactically, taking cover with any rock or other terrain features possible in this area, as the tank machine gunners and coaxial machine guns were laying down fire, along with the occasional frag T shell fired in this direction. As again, they would lose 1 vehicle from this company due to a heat shell fired from this tank here, trying to maneuver onto Center Gate Road, which led into the parking area of these heliport maintenance and hangars. The vehicles that remained would then break into the fencing, and with a third company swinging out along 338 coming down from the northeast going northwest, would pincer this area with fields of fire, cutting off escape from the back while simultaneously securing a major objective, which were the paved runways, as this last movement of this company coming in would cut off all form of escape for any conceivable remaining defenders. As this platoon was dismounted, comprised of its 5 squads, 2 squads moving up Centergate Road here would be supported by the other 3 squads bounding and covering into the baseball field, using the dugouts as cover, while this third squad was engaged in heavy hand-to-hand combat with the American troops that were in the scrub brush area. It was absolutely savage, as the hand-to-hand combat was some of the harshest, most brutal fighting in this particular battle, as it got extremely personal down at the soldier-to-soldier level. The fanaticism of the People's Armed Police overcoming their enemies in the field of battle, as the combat was total. This was total war. Absolute devastation, annihilation, decimation, all over the field of battle. While the People's Armed Police would suffer moderate casualties, these casualties would be spread throughout 2 different companies that were conducting the main attack. They would lose several of their wheel-based WZ-551 vehicles, but ultimately their fanaticism and speed, and even their shock and surprise, is how they snuck in relatively quietly, while the wrapping up of operations against the Army National Guard station were underway, as the People's Armed Police, a mile north of the Army National Guard station, were getting into place for their attack. They sprung their attack savagely against the positions of the Alpha Company, the main battle tank company from the 1st of the 635th. This particular battle space on this map was, again, 1.5 miles east to west by 1 mile north-south, and sat on a vital road junction which enabled the patrolling of the entire city on its ring roads and even through the center of it, as the highway system both bisected and surrounded Odessa, making this a key strategic position to hold. And as these 2 squads bounded and covered tactically into position by these hangars, as this tank tried desperately to get out of the way of the AI target-seeking mode guided loitering munitions looking for targets, they did the only thing they knew they could try and do, which was try to hug up against this hangar, and they were even going to try to get into the hangar by smashing through its walls to try to hide. These People's Armed Police squads promptly used their Type 74 flamethrowers to roast the crews inside of this single tank, as they let loose with a torrent of flame which could incinerate human targets in just a few seconds' time, as these powerful incendiary weapons were highly favored by the People's Armed Police. The rest of these squads, utilizing their small arms, some even utilizing their 35mm tube-fired grenades and their rocket-propelled grenades, either anti-personnel or light anti-armor warheads, and their HJ-08 ATGMs, were smashing their enemies on the field of battle, along with their wide array of drone-based capabilities, such as their loitering munition strikes and ATGM strikes from the 2 Wingloom 2s. All of this firepower slammed into their given targets with the artillery strikes, ground-based fires from the deployed squads, moving in to central positions around Wrangler Field, getting into these dugouts, using them as fighting positions against these tanks, troops that had fought hand-to-hand with this squad being overcome, leading to the squad at the end moving into this position after all the tanks had been eradicated. These two platoons, this platoon lining up in a single line formation of all 5 squads, taking corner positions to support actions of these squads of this platoon as they bounded and covered across the open heliport area. So this was a fuel tank. These were the concrete helipads, hangars, and maintenance areas. These tanks all being completely destroyed by the combination of ATGMs from the ground, from the Wing-Loon 2s, and also these struck this area and the tanks, and the loitering munitions, which were covering the area with a total of 48 heat warhead equipped loitering munitions. Again, it was only a 30-minute long battle, near the end of which these vehicles finally broke through the fencing and took positions here to look for stragglers hiding in these buildings, as all of these buildings would now be swept clean by the platoons from this company here and this company here arriving on scene, and this platoon watching the southern flanks of this column of 15 vehicles, of which 2 would be lost, and there would be 1 vehicle lost from this company deployed from here to here, as this was the highway area where combat had gone on between the non-combat troops that had gotten out of these vehicles and took positions. Flamethrowers were deployed against them. Well, there were even a few troops that had fuel and bottles and made Molotovs. These would fail. Only a few PAP troops would be KIA'd from fire from the top of this bridge, as the quadcopter assets mapping the area in real time, combined with the high-altitude drone assets and the satellite assets, already showed well ahead of the arrival of the PAP troops where their enemies were hiding in terms of the defending forces on site, and the PAP had seen all these retreating forces fleeing the destruction to the south, moving into the area, and already knew where they were, making it easy for these forces to engage and destroy them in battle. Even loitering munitions hit and destroyed these vehicles, including this MRAP on the top of this bridge overpass here, while 30mm autocannon fire shredded through concrete barriers with HE armor-piercing ammunition, or even simple armor-piercing ammunition, which was even more penetrating, and ripped through the personnel behind it with multiple bursts of fire, as well as also the troops firing up at the personnel hiding, using hand grenades, 35mm grenades, occasional ATGMs, as well as also rocket-propelled grenades to finish them off, along with the loitering munition strikes that were coming in as well, as the loitering munitions were also hitting their targets on the bridges, as the AI target-seeking mode prioritized high-altitude or high-position targets, as they would potentially have fields of fire that would be extremely dangerous to friendly forces on lower terrain, thus making forces on higher platforms or terrain vital targets to eliminate by the loitering munition strikes. At the end of this battle, as the People's Armed Police quickly claimed another victory, they would have 24 KIAs amongst their ranks, but split between the 2 main attacking companies, as the 3rd company coming in from the north came in after the fighting ended to look for stragglers in the hangar buildings, along with the other remaining troops of both companies. There would be 34 WIAs among both attacking companies, split between them both, but the entire Alpha Company would be destroyed as this shock and awe assault that was also very surgical in not destroying the infrastructure, as again, air power in the form of strike aircraft were prohibited, as was missile firepower from tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, and artillery was highly limited to specific areas. However, the surgical attacks from the combat drones and loitering munitions ensured with the deployed ground forces that they could not fail, as the AI integrated these fighting forces together through the most impressive ISR apparatus ever seen in human history to guide them in their attacks against the defending forces in this particular mission. Within 30 minutes, they crushed Alpha Company, leaving nothing but smoking hulks of metal behind of the destroyed vehicles, and many charred or ripped to pieces human cadavers littering the battlefield. All of this total devastation would see the area swept by the People's Armed Police forces of these three assaulting companies against this facility, while the remaining combat companies that hadn't been used of all 7 were deployed to guard the flanks of these operations to clear the National Guard Armory and the municipal airport. As victory had been achieved by 1:30 a.m. against Alpha Company, with all of their vehicles and personnel completely 100% annihilated, the toll on civilians was also devastating, as the People's Armed Police, fighting from people's backyards, enabled crossfire not only to hit their homes, but the People's Armed Police themselves destroyed many civilian homes when moving into position with their vehicles, breaking right through them or even laying down fire into them as they moved into position, some even using their flamethrowers to burn them to the ground as well. In this hellish war of total annihilation, Wei Fang, the People's Armed Police Supreme Commander, as he received a lateral transfer, who was effectively the Heinrich Himmler of the East, would see his wishes come to pass, as his brutal People's Armed Police shock forces destroyed the enemy on the battlefield, as well as cracked down on enemies of the state, which effectively was the entire American population. In areas where the PLA occupied freshly conquered zones, civilian population was treated with relative humanity and dignity, but not where the People's Armed Police had taken control. And as they swept the airport of all enemy combatants and now occupied a key position in the north of Odessa, as well as also flattening the National Guard Armory, Odessa was effectively under complete control of the People's Armed Police, save for a few trouble spots. One would emerge later, but there was a building containing a paramilitary force that would have to be assaulted a bit later. Even militia forces that were mustering at this time would race into the city to join the fight, using underground networks to infiltrate and try to attack the People's Armed Police, who knew about these subterranean tactics well, as again, they were one of the premier counterinsurgency forces in the entire world and would be able to fight back and fight back viciously, especially with their light mechanized infantry forces who specialized in this type of warfare against these tactics. As it pertained to the other paramilitary force, the National Construction and Production Corps in the area, they, by now, were ready to move in to construct a megafob out of the former International Air and Spaceport of Midland, as there are 4 civil engineering companies and their third of 3 sapper companies, or effectively combat engineer companies, would move in after the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armor Division's 2 battalions assigned to this objective would defeat all the defending forces. They were now waiting to the south to move in and begin construction of the megafob, as 2 of their 3 sapper companies would be deployed in battle to seize as much as possible intact the ICE detention facility to use as a laogai or slave labor camp for the labor brigades that would be conscripted of the local populations. As the National Construction and Production Corps troops had their orders and missions, the People's Armed Police were getting on with theirs as well, as the Service Support Company would also fly medevac operations in the case of the fighting that had occurred in the north of Odessa. The grounds in one person's backyard effectively would be used as a medevac landing zone to evacuate the KIAs and WIAs from this platoon of this company here, while also there would be the use of the heliports themselves in the airport grounds to medevac troops from these squads who would suffer WIAs and a few KIAs in combat against this particular tank platoon. As The PAP used shock tactics against their enemies and were again brutally aggressive, more so than most other fighting forces, although the Iranian Pasdaran, or Revolutionary Guard Corps, had deployed some units in this invasion, and they too were extremely aggressive against the locals as a highly well-armed paramilitary shock force like the People's Armed Police. The PAP, despite suffering moderate casualties, although they were well spread throughout their different fighting forces, saw these losses as acceptable to achieve their endgame, which was the complete and total conquest of the nation, including their particular piece of it, which in the Midland-Odessa battle space was all of their assigned objectives in accordance with the original invasion war planning. As now, many other battles that had begun at 12:30 a.m., 30 minutes into it, after the preliminary artillery, missile, and airstrikes had kicked everything off, the People's Armed Police armored battalions were effectively the star of the show, if you will, as they held the bulk of the heavy firepower of the division, while the light mechanized infantry were more of a supporting force to the armored forces, as they could move far faster and could outflank enemies quicker, while the armored forces conducted the heavy punching. In the case of the assault against the Alpha Company, the reason why the light mechanized infantry had been chosen was because they could arrive on scene by far the fastest. And their deployed infantry shock forces could spread out, use the terrain to their advantage as prescribed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as well as also their weaponry as prescribed according to the same battle management AI system, and their quasi-elite training to completely and thoroughly eradicate their enemy. As the U.S. Army National Guard, while a part of the Army, was not the active duty forces and effectively were part-timers, they essentially had nothing in terms of training on the People's Armed Police, as their training was far more aggressive and was also far more stringent. Because again, these were a quasi-elite force, whereas the National Guard were essentially part-time troops. And the anti-tank weaponry of the People's Armed Police, along with the integration of artificial intelligence with their combat drones and loitering munitions, won them the day at this combat in the airport, as their vehicles sat further back and provided them heavy fire support with 30mm autocannon fire, as well as also heavy machine gun fire in the form of their W-85 12.7mm heavy machine guns. The troops of Alpha Company had never seen it coming and had been completely and totally overwhelmed, even as their commander of these armored forces in their fortified positions, which were sandbagged as the tents were just off of this illustration or animation, were completely pummeled by a single firing battery of 122mm howitzers, which rained down destruction on their positions. As again, many other battles were flaring up 30 minutes into the invasion after the preliminary strikes, and in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the battle over the ICE detention facility, which was wanted as much intact as humanly possible, as well as the destruction of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, a combat battalion of combat engineers, would be carried out by an armored battalion from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as well as 2 sapper companies from the 350th National Construction and Production Corps Construction Battalion, as the remaining sapper company again, and the 3 civil engineering companies had moved closer to the Midland International Air and Spaceport to prepare to move in and begin their construction operations of the facility, while the sapper companies prepared to assault across Highway 385, upon which sat these facilities, in a pincer action with the armored battalion of People's Armed Police armored forces of their light tank companies and armored infantry, as they would assault the facilities and forces defending them together, which included a sizable number of ICE paramilitary personnel operating in conjunction with the combat engineers of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, which belonged to the larger 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team. More to come in the next video.